Hi, I'm Katrina Norris. I'm the Executive Director for Indiana State Psychiatric Hospital Network, and I am honored to be here today to talk to you about addiction, the family disease. So, the American Medical Association and the American Society for Addiction Medicine have varying definitions of what addiction is or what it is not. And I really prefer the ASAM definition because it recognizes the brain chemistry and how the brain chemistry is changed in the addicted brain. I call that the hijacked brain most of the time. So wanted to share those with you and just really tell you about my story and how I got here, because addiction is a complex, chronic, treatable disease. We know that. We have all the research. We have MAT. We have multiple courses of treatment for addiction. What we often fail to recognize, or what we fail to talk about, is that addiction is a family disease. It's far more complex than just the person suffering with substance use disorder. So when I say it's the family disease, I say that because it impairs severe dysfunction in a family unit. And I could give you a million examples of how, when you have a loved one who is suffering with substance use disorder, how you cope with that person and how you cope with your other family members because of that person. How you interact with each other, it changes drastically once the person that you love has a substance use disorder. You love your child, you hate the disease, and that, I think, is what makes this so complex. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about my story and how we got here. Caitlin is my daughter, and Caitlin was a honor student. She was an athlete. She graduated high school midterm. She was sassy, and very had the fire, I guess, of what you want from a strong, independent woman. And I thought, this is going to be okay, even though she was a little sassy. It was, we had our days, like most parents do with adolescents. At 19, Caitlin had a child, and I wasn't exactly thrilled to become a grandma at 39. So that was not exactly where I wanted to be, but life happens. You take your blessings as they come. And she had a C-section. So when she left the hospital, she left with 90 Percocets for a C-section. And I didn't really think about it in that sense of, boy, that's a lot of opioids to leave. I've never had a C-section. Who am I to judge? And someone's prescribing practices, loved her OB doc, trusted him. And that's where our journey began with prescription opioids, which most families can obviously relate to, that we've seen this epidemic unfold based on prescription drugs. Within 6 months, we were into IV heroin use. So it didn't take long for her brain to change, and that wasn't enough. That prescription medication no longer fulfilled the craving in the brain. I mean, it was a very short window of time. So, like I said, things got worse, and very rapidly got worse, in the sense that from taking prescription drugs that were given to me by a doctor, so they're safe, and that myth, to IV street-level heroin. You don't know what's in it. My granddaughter was born, and by the time she was 18 months old, I had guardianship of her. So how we got to that place was multiple overdoses, multiple arrests, multiple failed treatment attempts, and ultimately my child had become homeless, and not homeless and living under the bridge with the paper sack stigma, but homeless and couch surfing. Not that she couldn't come home, that it was always on the table. You can always come home. But there were rules at home. And in addiction, they don't like the rules. The rules don't work for them in getting their needs met and their cravings. So what ended up happening was drug dealing. Drug dealing happened because that was a means to support this habit that now was a necessity. And I think that is what most families don't know, is when you're addicted to opioids, you just want to be well. And it's no longer about getting high. It's about staying well. It's about not being sick. And so she was chasing wellness by her definition, because I knew the clinical manifestations. I knew the things that were happening in her brain. And it put me in a very awkward position where she would talk to people and they'd say, your mom saved my life. And I couldn't save hers. So you can see how complex this got for someone who knows it and knows this disease in and out and how to treat it, but I couldn't get her what she needed. And ultimately, one of the biggest days of my career, I'm going to ribbon cutting to open a treatment facility, excited, on a project I'd worked years on, and I'm driving with my best dress hung up in the back seat and my heels, and I'm so excited. We're going to cut the ribbon. We're going to open North Star Recovery Center, and the radio clicks on, and it is our local news, local radio station, and I hear Jeff Lane's voice come across the airwaves, and my daughter's been arrested for dealing heroin. And she's posted bond within 6 hours of arrest. So I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to go open this facility. I've got all these people waiting. We've planned months for it. What am I going to do? And I've got to get on stage and I've got to talk about this and how we're going to save people. And my kid just got arrested. So it was, again, that internal tug of war. What do? You're going to stain my day. And that's how you feel as a parent, as this was my day that I'd poured my heart and soul into for years. And again, the disease of addiction had put a strain on that. So the emotions that families feel and that they experience is like a roller coaster. You love them, they're your child, and you remember the sweet, innocent little girl, or you remember going to softball games and all of these other pieces of childhood memories, and then they've wrecked my plans for the day, and now I've got to compartmentalize my feelings, and I've got to go on stage, and I've got deliverables to do, because that's my job, and hold it together. And I remember that day so vividly, because I come off stage, my CEO is coming in to check on me, and he was like, man, you knocked it out of the park, way to go, way to go. And when I turned around, I was just flooded in tears, and he was like, what is wrong? And I have to stand there and tell my boss they've arrested my kid. And I know the prison sentence that it carries. But yet I know she has to be accountable for breaking the law. So you're just constantly in this mixed emotion state. And if you're in a professional position, or any position for that matter, as a family member, you still have to survive. So you still got to go to work. You still got to do your job. And it is absolutely insanity, as much for the person suffering from the disease as the family that's coping with it. One of the emotions that most families experience, and they sometimes don't know it, is enabling. And that enabling comes from parental guilt. You go back in your head and you think of everything you've ever done wrong, like parenting comes with, a guide or something. Here's how you raise perfect kids. Every kid is different, but you really beat yourself up and you think about, did I miss a red flag? Should I have put her in this extracurricular activity? Should we have attended more church services? Where did I go wrong? How did I do this and end up with a person suffering from substance use disorder that I love so much, that had so much potential? And families will start to make excuses for behaviors. They will give the person money. They'll blame other people. Oh, and I'm as guilty as anybody for that. And I knew better. I was a trained professional, And I knew better. But I did make excuses for her behavior. I did blame people for her behavior. You know, it was the crowd she was running with, it was the person she was dating, and that's all enabling behavior. There's also more. It's just, there's more. It's more complex. There's more emotions. There's anger, there's resentment, there's hurt. And for Caitlin and her situation, I already had her daughter. I had guardianship of her daughter and was caring for her daughter, who had lots of questions. And you don't want to have conversations with, you know, a two or three year old about substance use disorder. She came up pregnant again. And so you talk about mad, you talk about anger and hurt, and how could you do this again? You already have one that I'm raising, and now you have another. And I was adamant. I was not getting involved. I was not taking this baby. She was not putting me through this again. And I held strong for a long time until I was teaching a class at the IU East campus, and my phone rang, and it was Reed Health, and I answered, stepped outside my classroom and took it. And they said, we're care flighting your grandson to Methodist. And I was like, my what? Your grandson. He was just born. And I was like, oh, it's too early. That's premature. He's in respiratory distress. That's all I can tell you. My daughter was incarcerated when he was born. So nobody would give me any information, because she was an offender. They have policies they have to follow. I didn't know his name. I didn't know where he was going. I didn't know Riley had a NICU inside of Methodist. I didn't know anything. All I knew is if you're care flighting in February, something's seriously wrong. So that was a Thursday when he was born. I finally tracked him down on Saturday. And I'm still adamant I was not getting involved. And because she was incarcerated when he was born, DCS was obviously called, and they called me. Why don't you take him? You got the other one. I was not prepared at all for him, but as soon as I got to the NICU and I saw him, that emotion come in. And even though I had resentment and I had hurt, I was like, okay, I can't let a kid go to the system. This is my blood. He's my blood. And he's super cute too, so that helps. It's kind of hard, and I held him that first time, and he had had no skin-to-skin contact. Remember, she was an offender. She was handcuffed to the bed. So he had had no skin-to-skin contact, and they had his breathing under control, etc., which was good. And the first thing I said is, what's in his system? And they said, well, the records we received, his UDS was clean. I said, there's no way. She was only in jail 2 days before he was born. So when she went to jail, she went into withdrawal, which then led to premature birth, kicked her into labor is what it did. And I was like, there's no way. That's not possible. You can't clean your system in 2 days. And one of the nurses behind me was speaking to a colleague, and the term junkie was in their conversation. And I don't know if that was about my grandson. Trick baby was said when I was sitting in that NICU. I don't know if that was about my grandson, but I remember sitting there holding him and hearing those words and going, words matter. Stigma hurts families, because that's a human life to me. It doesn't matter how he was conceived, how he came into the world, etc. That stigma and the things that people hear, they stick with you. So they're telling me he's fine, and they want a discharge plan, and we're working on, getting everything set up. And talk about a scramble. Go ahead and set a nursery up in 24 hours or so, and work full time and have another child at my age. It's painful. Hour 96, Camden, my grandson, started to display the symptoms of neonatal abstinence syndrome, or NAS. So it took him 96 hours to start to show those symptoms. So Of course, you look at the stats and they say, well, 7 of every 1,000 babies are diagnosed with NAS. And that doesn't sound too bad, 7 of 1,000, until you put it in perspective, which is every 19 minutes in our country, according to the CDC, babies are being born with NAS. And it is something like I've never experienced in my life. I can remember the social worker saying, oh, it's like colic, but a little bit worse. And I was like, okay, colicky babies, we know what to do with babies, and I'm a mom, and we hug them and we kiss them and we love them. Not in my brain going, you couldn't love addiction out of your daughter. Love didn't save her, because God knows I had enough love to save her. And it didn't. So 13 days in the NICU, morphine process of weaning my grandson before he could come home. And when I brought him home, I'm thinking colic. It's going to be like colic. That's what they told me. That was that was putting it mildly. So he was a baby like I'd never seen before. And so when I would think about how widely varied the symptoms are, the manifestations are, I lived it. You couldn't feed him, you couldn't bathe him, you couldn't change his diaper without him screaming. This just high pitch doesn't even define how he screamed. Sensitive to touch, sensitive to sound, hyperactive reflexes. Like, for example, if I would cough or sneeze, he would jump out of his skin. Well, all babies have a startle reflex. His startle reflex was impacted up until over a year old. He had a very abnormal startle reflex. Fortunately, we did not go into seizure activity, but we did see the jerking that is often a clinical presentation of NAS. The biggest issues with Camden was he didn't sleep. He was not a normal baby. He did not sleep. You think newborns, they sleep 18 hours a day. He was like an insomniac. And so up until he was 15 months old, he didn't sleep through the night. And I was still running a hospital every day. And it is, I have all these cute pictures of him, and he looks great. And if you look at me, I've got like these huge circles under my eyes because I was getting up every 2 to 3 hours with him. And he just looks happy as can be. And I'm looking like, I'm exhausted because I am. And he was such a tough baby that you sit back and you think about it and you go, I never knew about why someone would shake a baby. You read about shaken baby syndrome, and we educate people about shaken baby syndrome. And in the back of your head, we're all judgmental, whether we want to admit it or not. We go, why would anybody shake a baby? Well, I know why people shake babies. I finally got it. I finally understood, because there were so many times I would lay him in the little mama-roo thing that bounces. It's supposed to simulate the womb and calm babies. I would have to strap him in and walk away because I was so frustrated. You can only take so many hours of high-pitched crying, screaming, and what traditionally works to calm an infant didn't work for him. You couldn't rub soothing lotion on him. You couldn't hold him. Swaddling worked for a while, but not forever. So a lot of times it was just, I've got to walk away. He's safe. I've got to walk away. I've got to get myself together. I get it. I know now why this can happen to anybody, to any family, because it's hard. It is so hard. And then your brain races about, okay, what's next? And I was probably overzealous in thinking about long-term outcomes. And I can remember going to the pediatrician's office, every 3 months or whenever you go for your checks, and saying, is everything okay? Is everything okay? And the pediatrician saying, he's fine. Look at him on the growth chart. He's a miracle. This is fantastic. And I'm like, Doc, he's not sleeping, and I'm not sleeping, and this is not safe for anybody. And even the physician who was my daughter's pediatrician her whole life saying, oh, it's okay, he'll get there, he'll sleep eventually. And I kept asking the doctor, how can we see what's next, what's going to happen? And only time's going to tell that. Only time's going to tell if there are learning disabilities. I think about the predisposition and fear things like, what does the future hold if he breaks a bone? How are we going to cope with pain? Because I know his brain already knows what that substance makes him feel like. And scared to give him anything. I was so afraid to try anything because I know how his brain was wired in utero. And so that has been interesting. The fear of SIDS was so real for me that if he would sleep a 4-hour block, I would be up in there checking to see if he was breathing. Because I knew all that stuff, and it made me extremely anxious. I can remember calling my husband. My husband works third shift. In the middle of the night, you've got to come home from work. I can't do this anymore. And he's like, oh my goodness, this is serious. The impact was so serious that we had to ask for family medical leave time. Not because of Camden per se, but because I couldn't handle it. It was impacting me emotionally so much that I'd be in the middle of the floor crying while he was crying. And so it was that moment where you go, I'm not good enough. I've never been good enough. And remember, I talked about those emotions. And then you get angry because you see this baby tremoring. You see this baby not sleeping. And who do you get mad at? I got mad at my daughter. Why would you do this? Why would you put him through it? But she's still my daughter. So you can't hate your child. You hate the disease. And it just brings all of these emotions in simultaneously that it becomes overwhelming. The memorable moments that she's missed with her children, they can't come back. She will never see her daughter go to preschool the first day. She'll never see that first Easter, the first time her son ate, a solid food. And that brings those emotions back too. Like, I'm not this child's parent, but I'm having to act as this child's parent. And again, you get angry, you get resentful, and your family unit is so impacted. If I can just tell you about the jealousy, we have 2 other children besides Caitlin in our family unit. And, they won't say, oh, we're jealous of Caitlin. They're not going to say that. But the reality is they are, because she takes the time, she takes the energy, she takes the money. And if it's not her, it's the children that we're raising for her. So I've got 6 grandkids and 2 of them live with me. Those other 4 grandkids feel that strain. So it creates jealousy and tension in the family unit from the sibling side. It also impacts the marital relations. My husband and I are at a place in our life and our careers where we should be able to do things by ourselves and not have to worry about childcare. But we do. The money, my goodness. I've spent a lot of money because of the disease of addiction. Not just in treatment facilities and outpatient and all of the other options, but in childcare. Childcare is extremely expensive, but it's also a health issue. I'm older. I'm doing what people traditionally do in their 20s and their 30s, which is normal child rearing age. So it impacts your health, both physical and mentally. Fortunately, I'm still here, but I don't know how I'm here. I'm just still here. So this disease is not just of that person, but it has literally impacted our entire family unit and our entire family functioning. And always on guard. It used to be before Camden was born and before Caitlin was incarcerated, every time the phone would ring, my heart would sink. It's another overdose. Is this that call that every parent fears? And I don't have that fear today, but I had to prepare for the worst and hope for the best for the past 5 years now. We're looking at going on 5 years total. So how do you help them? That's the $1 million question, is how do you help them? When do you tough love them? How do you still love your child that's inside that trapped, hijacked brain? And it is hard. And all I can say is they're going to choose those drugs over you. They're going to choose the drugs over your children, their children. They're going to choose it over everything. And it's not because they don't love you or they don't love their children. That brain has been so hijacked they can't not be well. And that's what I want to stress to families. As frustrating as the lying, the manipulation, the stealing, all of the negative attributes of addiction are, is they're literally trapped in their own head and their body is physically responding. Can they die in withdrawal? No, but they'll wish they were dead. And a lot of people will take their lives to avoid that. So it is really about families knowing you got to know your resources, when to reach out, and when to ask for help. That was hard for me. I knew the treatment facilities. I knew the MAT options. I knew about Narcan. I was trained in Narcan. I still carry Narcan in my bag everywhere I go, 7 days a week. There's support groups. Al-Anon is fantastic for families, and people laugh at me. I've got great supports. I'm so fortunate to have great supports. But one of the greatest, most convenient supports I had came from a group on Facebook. And it was a Facebook group about parents of addicts, and people would share their stories and they would comment and they would pray for one another. And it was something that I could access at any time. Facebook is always on. You can scroll through at 2 o'clock in the morning when Camden's been up for the third time. And I didn't feel alone. You've got to rely on people. You've got to be able to ask for help. And that was so hard for me to tell people I can't do anymore. I'm going to break. But you really do. You have to take care of yourself. And I started to see the symptoms, like my weight fluctuated greatly. Either I was packing on the pounds because at 2 o'clock if he's eating, I'm eating, or I was significantly dropping weight. And if you would have talked to me from a clinical standpoint, or if someone would ever get a hold of my journals, my personal journals that I write in, they would say she's clinically depressed, because I had all of those signs and those symptoms. I had sleep disturbance, I had weight disturbance, I had emotional moments of outbreaks, and it feels lonely. It really does, and that's why the supports are so important. So is it worth it? It's worth it. Probably couldn't have told me that a few months ago when he still wasn't sleeping. But I now would say it's worth it, because today I can look at Carissa. She's almost 6 years old. She's going to start kindergarten in a week, and her ACEs score is a 5, the same as her mom's. And that's important to me, because I know how then to send in the preventative measures and put the supports in place. Camden's ACEs score is a 2. And he was born in distress that we can't imagine. He couldn't breathe, and that for me is a fear. It'd be terrible not to be able to breathe. And then he went through all of the physical ailments, but his ACEs score as of today is a 2. So it was worth it, because had I not intervened, his ACEs score would be extremely higher. As hard as it is, as many times as I've said, what am I doing? I must be out of my mind. I can look back today, I can look at them today and say, okay, now we know what's next, and how to prepare that transition back. The other is true of Caitlin, and I very firmly have said this for a very long time. Dead people can't recover. We cannot give up on our loved ones. We have to be trained and ready to respond with things like Narcan, because if they're dead, they can't recover. Now, how many times is enough? I don't know that answer. For each family, it's different. And we know addiction is a lifelong disease. It's a chronic, relapsing, complex disease. But today she is 17 months sober, not by her own choice. I say the Department of Correction was the one place she couldn't sign herself out of. You know, after multiple failed treatment options, she couldn't sign herself out of prison. So am I glad she got convicted and went to prison? Obviously, no. That's not a proud mom badge you wear, but it kept her alive. And I want other families to know, you've got to find your balancing act of when are you enabling, when are you not, and how to cut it off. Yeah, education, support, family therapy, all of those things are important for families to do and to know, and you have to read and know what you're reading too, because there's a lot of stuff that I read that I was like, that's not academic, that's not right. And being able to sort and filter through when is enough for a family. I can't answer that. I can only say that for my family, we're going to give it another shot. And so when she comes home and she meets her children, she has a lot of acclimating to do, and we have a lot of challenges ahead of us in the coming months, but she's recovered at this point, and I'm going to support her as she makes this journey into long-term recovery, which we know is possible.